I'm not allowed to swear anymore.
Oh, sheesh. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We've got just 1 minute until we get started, but welcome. And go ahead, if somebody doesn't mind just throwing into the chat whether or not you can hear us okay. We'll kind of create a little bit of a sound test here just to make sure that everything's functioning as we hope it will be before we get started. If someone could just drop in the chat that you can hear us, even let us know where you're joining from, that would be awesome. Perfect. Thanks, guys. That's great.
Lots of
welcome.
Familiar faces.
Yeah. Welcome.
She's sick, so I'm heading this way.
He's trying to keep his distance from me. It's the usual. Excellent. We got Leduc, Ottawa, Colorado. Oh, Brian. Of course. It's Brian.
That guy.
Awesome. Quebec, Calgary, Cowtown. We know where that is. Awesome. Excellent. Let's go ahead and get started. Perfect. Oh, there we go. All right, so there we go. Close up.
Technical difficulty.
There we go.
There we go.
Perfect. Well, welcome once again. We are excited to have you join us for our 5th episode of the Cash Flow Queries webinar series. And I'm Twyla.
I'm Kelvin.
And we have an accounting and advisory firm called 2080 Financial Services. And we also have a cash flow forecasting tool called Helm. And we started this series of webinars back last July, it was, believe it or not. And we've really kind of gone on this journey of starting with where do you begin with cash flow through to now, where we're going to talk a bit about cash flow and how advisory begins with cash flow. So
it's been since July.
It's been since July.
Wow.
Yep.
Kudos to us.
I know, right? We stuck with it. Let's go through the agenda today. So just a few pieces of housekeeping. Please use the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom menu there. We will have some time at the end for Q&A, so go ahead and ask any questions that you have, and we'll be sure to get to those at the end of the webinar. We'll give you a little bit more about our background. We'll speak about then, of course, the core topic today, advisory and cash flow. We're also going to dive into some real client examples. So we've dug into our own list of clients to see what we could pull out for examples of how cash flow really, or advisory really began with cash flow. So we'll get into that, and then we'll wrap up with Q&A.
My turn.
Your turn. This is you.
So we've had our accounting firm since around 2014. So it's almost been 6 years now. And I believe it's this March or April that it'll officially be 6. Yeah, it's been a long journey. We always played in the part-time controller, part-time CFO space. We do bookkeeping all the way up to tax returns, but we really tried to focus on the more managerial accounting and advisory space. So what everybody seems to be told to move to, what people are trying to move to, we've always lived there. And so a natural advantage that we have in kind of giving these topics is that we have experience. Cash flow forecasting for us was always a big piece of our services. And so we just love to talk about it because we've got some good experience there.
Excellent. All right, so I just wanted to start with kind of speaking to the elephant in the room, because I suspect that there's some people who might read this title of the webinar today and say advisory begins with cash flow, and that we might just think that because we have a cash flow forecasting tool. And so I wanted to just really address that, because our bias or our belief around why advisory begins with cash flow is not from Helm. It's not from creating and trying to market Helm as a cash flow tool. It's actually from that experience that Kelvin was talking about. We have spent a lot of time in the advisory space. We offer cash flow forecasting as a key service to our clients, and we've seen with our own experience that it really becomes the heart of the advisory work that we do for the clients. And so I really wanted to just kind of include a point here to say that we don't have the bias around why advisory begins with cash flow because of the fact that we have a cash flow forecasting tool. We have the bias because we truly believe it, and because we really want to kind of encourage you to explore cash flow, especially if you are maybe new to advisory or just looking to get into advisory. It's something that, as we'll dive into, can really be kind of the heart of that relationship with the client. And then naturally, from our experience with Helm or with 2080, that did then parlay into the development of Helm. And it's why we wanted to create a tool that we could use ourselves and that other accounting and bookkeeping professionals could use, that's granular and visual, and giving you something that you can action off of and really work with your clients and help them forecast their cash flow and make some get those insights and make those decisions.
There was a question about, do you get the slides?
Oh, I could send out the slides. I don't typically send the slides out, but it's something that we could do. So perfect, thanks.
So part of what Twyla was talking about was our passion and interest behind cash flow and cash flow management services, and where that stemmed from. And really that kind of came from our own client experience. But the more that we delved into the topic and the more we built out our app, the more we actually got familiar with the statistics behind cash flow forecasting and business success and failure rates and this, that, the other. So a lot of people know that most businesses fail due to cash flow, but they might not know the actual statistics behind it. So quite often you hear that, you know, the majority, so half of businesses fail in 5 years. But the reality is that 80%, so almost all businesses fail after 10 years. And the reason that they do fail is cash flow issues. So you can still be profitable, but still fail due to a cash flow issue. Mm-hmm. And that number is 80% of the 80%. So, you know, 64% of all businesses fail simply because of cash flow. Those statistics are across the world. If you go to the UK, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they're very, very close in all industrialized nations. So it really goes to show that it's not a North American issue, it's not a UK issue, it's not a regional or geographic issue, it's simply a small business issue. We believe that that's because most small business owners are good at what they're doing, which is the service, the widget, the product. They're not so good at the business management side of things. And so if you kind of forecast that moving forward on the progression of what a small business does, they're very good at what they do. They have some very good traction, but typically the wheels fall off the bus simply because they're not planning the finances. So they might be super successful, have a great product, but they're likely still going to fail because they haven't managed the financial side. So that goes to the last statistic that we're showing there. The survival rate of businesses, this is also in statistics, is 90% if people do manage their cash flow. And so you've got a very, very big problem that can be easily solved by simply looking out into the future, doing some very simple planning around it. And if you can do that, if the business can do it, or if the company can do it, the accounting company can do it for their client, you're almost guaranteed success.
Yeah, I really want to highlight that last point because, you know, I think we've all heard those first three stats before in some form or another. It's kind of their numbers or percentages that get thrown around often. But then when you look at the last one that says survival rates of businesses that actually manage their cash are 90%, I just think that's huge. That has such an impact. And to me, that, you know, if you think about an accounting professional, we all have the same motive. We want to help small businesses. That's what we are ultimately trying to achieve. And so if we know that 90% of businesses that actually manage their cash do succeed, then that's an opportunity to help the small business in a way that's really going to help them to thrive and to grow and to sustain their business. And so I just when I hear that one, it just hits me as an accounting professional to say, that's my opportunity to really help instead of doing, you know, perhaps some of the other work that I've already been doing, which is helpful. They still have to be compliant and they still have to have their tax return filed, but this is a way to actually help them be successful.
For sure.
So we just wanted to include this report that already speaks to what Kelvin just shared, but it's a report that was put out by Intuit last February called The State of Small Business Cash Flow. And, it kind of touches on in different formats what Kelvin just kind of walked through. But even if you just look at the first line alone, and it says 69% of small business owners have been kept up at night by concerns about cash flow. And this is something that we've definitely seen in our accounting firm, is that clients are just stressed about cash. So they'll come to us with things like, will I make payroll? Or is there going to be enough come in before the end of the month in order to be able to make rent on time? Or can I pay this large vendor bill right now because they're calling for payment? And so those types of questions are often what we have heard in our firm. And this is the types of questions that they're mulling over at night and saying, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. Will I have enough money to be able to continue with my operations? And that's something that we've found has great value in terms of offloading that on from the client, which we'll dive into a little bit more. But I just thought this was kind of an interesting piece of backup that was put out by Intuit about a year ago that I can even put the link to it because there's more slides to their report. This was just one of the slides in that State of Small Business Cash Flow that they put out last year.
Yeah, so excuse me, speaking to what you just said, cash flow is the number one stressor for all small business owners. It is what keeps them up at night. It's what they all worry about. They really want to fix it. I mean, the necessary evils are tax returns, GST, sales tax filings, all of that stuff. But a lot of business owners don't have help in that managerial, operational, financial aspect. And so that's why it's the number one stressor. Can they survive? And so if you take all of the statistics that we put in the slides to now, you've got something that happens to almost everybody, I should say. So almost everybody experiences a cash flow issue. A lot of people are going to maybe go out of business because of a cash flow issue. It's the number one stressor. So that really kind of says there's huge demand for this service across the board. It is the number one issue in our opinion. And the ledger system, so the zeros and the QBOs and the Sages, they would all say the same thing. This is a huge topic or a huge issue that they see for all of their small business users. And so what that means to us is they will actually value the service. And so when you're a professional trying to find new service lines, new ways to offer help for your clients, this is a huge area. And it's kind of the Wild West in the sense that there's not really a lot of people doing it. In our own statistics, as well as with others, I believe it was Accounting Web, less than 1/3 of all accountants or professionals, so bookkeepers as well, less than 1/3 of professionals actually offer cash management services. So you've got something that's important to everyone, every client, but very few people are doing it. And there's multiple reasons for that. There could be confidence, there could be skill sets, there could be whatever, but it's not hard. It's not rocket science. You can do it. You just got to spend some time on it. And if you do it, there's a massive advantage for those firms and those professionals that are willing to take a stab at it, because everybody wants it. They're going to value it. They're going to pay for it. And I'm not saying we're gouging them, but they're going to pay fair value for your services. So it's not going to be $50 an hour. And if you do it as a firm or as a professional, you're going to have a huge competitive advantage, in our opinion. We even saw it with 2080, our accounting firm, and its growth. A large component of that was due to offering cash flow services, cash management services, really helping out people with the day-to-day managing their bank account, because it offloaded so much stress. It gave us that trusted advisor position. It made them feel happy, made us feel good, great relationships, and it allowed our firm to kind of take off. So we believe, and the statistics would say, that it offers you a major competitive advantage as a professional firm.
Yeah, for sure. I think the only other thing I want to add there is that it can be such a differentiator between, being a business coach or business consultant when you're offering cash flow advisory, because a lot of times, we've even had some very small business clients come to us, and when we first start working with them, they've got some sort of business coach, or they've got some sort of mentor, or they've got somebody who's already advising them and giving them guidance. But what that advisor or that coach or that mentor is not doing is cash flow forecasting. So they may speak to it, and they may, typically they understand the importance of it, but they're not actually offering it. And so, when you're wanting to kind of differentiate yourself and your services, advisor doesn't really mean anything to the client. And when you start to say, but I'm going to partner with you and I'm going to be more like a consultant or a coach, or then they start to go to the other side where they're like, well, now you're less numbers and I've got somebody who's doing that. So it's kind of bridging that gap and creating a differentiator as to what type of advisor are you and how will you really be able to partner with them and help their business. And so that's something that we've really found, that even some of the very smallest clients that you would think, how does that person afford to have a coach? But they do. And it's a way to say that coach is great. And sometimes you can even work in tandem with that coach and say, okay, well, here's the pieces that coach is not filling in. And so we can kind of work together and get really collaborative and really help out the small business owner.
Yep. And I was going to say, it's not even just, it is collaboration, because sometimes business coaches and business consultants will know the importance of cash flow management and forecasting. And so it's a case of implementing it, because at the end of the day, that still might get left to the small business user, the client. And where do you start?
Yeah, exactly. All right, so let's dive in here a little bit more to speak to that. And so, when you want to become an advisor or offer advisory services, you really need two things. You need a solid understanding of the business. You need to be able to, and this is all types of advisory. If you're going to advise a small business owner in terms of what they should do within their small business, you need to have a really good understanding of that business. And secondly, they have to trust you. They have to actually take your opinion and have it considered in their decision making. And so that understanding and that trust is hugely important. And that's not something that you gain overnight. And, from clients that we have worked on previously where we aren't doing kind of this level of service, that takes longer, because they kind of have put you into this spot of, here's what you do and just do what you do, and you kind of stay doing that, and I need you to do that, but it kind of pigeonholes you into what that looks like in terms of that relationship with the client. And so once you start doing cash flow forecasting, we've seen this ourselves, is you just naturally have this deep understanding of the business, because the initial start of doing the very first cash flow forecast for the client, you're forced to go through the exercise of what is coming in or what's projected to come in and what does go out. And if you kind of rewind to that very first episode that we did back in July, we spoke to starting with cash flow forecasting using Excel. And with Excel, basically what you're trying to create is the forecasted bank statements. So line by line, what are the ins and outs that are going to happen for that small business over the next 90 days? And so you naturally, organically get so deep into every little detail of the client that you just create this understanding that, truthfully, once you actually get to the point where you're now presenting that to their client, you now know more than they typically know. And so, or they're surprised that you know as much as you do. And it's because of that process of creating the cash flow forecast. And once you actually create the first one, obviously you don't spend as much time in the details because you've got a few things systematized. But the initial onset of creating that forecast is that you get that understanding that I haven't been able to recreate that knowledge of the client any other way. And so when you're trying to create that understanding of the business, I believe that the cash flow forecasting just will naturally create that. And then when you take that to the client, it can then start to lead to some of the different questions. Because if you're going to start to, you can flip the slide if you want. If you're going to start to forecast revenue and incoming cash flow, you naturally just start to ask different questions that you wouldn't have needed to ask when you're filing their tax return, or when you're running their payroll, or when you're filing their sales tax. You don't need to know those forward-looking numbers in that traditional kind of a role. And so you just naturally start to ask about revenue. You ask about timing with certain vendors, because a lot of times cash flow forecasting is really, it kind of, you're managing a cash gap in a lot of scenarios. So you're looking at things like what does vendor timing need to be? And is there any sort of tolerance? And when are these certain loan payments due? And especially payments that are maybe quarterly, annually, you start to ask some different questions that are all very proactive. And that naturally changes the relationship, because now the client's kind of intrigued by you're asking these questions that nobody's potentially ever asked them before. And you're actually getting a real sense of what's coming down the pipe. And so this just organically starts to create these higher value conversations and just builds that layer of trust. And once you have that layer of trust, then advisory can kick off. But until then, it's hard for you to be able to go to the client and say, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and you need to take my advice when you haven't established that trust. So it's just kind of a foundational service that offers huge value, because we saw that the success rates of businesses that actually manage their cash, but then naturally creates the understanding and the trust with the client that is kind of a spin-off that then works to your advantage to offer other advisory services.
Mm-hmm. No, and I think that's entirely accurate. It's a really great point to make, in that, you know, if you're sitting there at a high level, it's really hard to get that granular information, which is actually really important to make the high level decisions, because you're sitting there and saying, well, why are your expenses too high? If you're actually digging into those numbers, maybe not on a daily basis, but, you know, looking at them, so you see the weekly patterns, you ask questions around who these vendors are, you know, what are these customers doing, you get a much better picture of the overall flow and ebb of the company and where you can do that. So, you know, you're taking a more granular short-term look, but that can then, you can use that information to create higher level strategic forecasts. So, you know, more 3 to 5 year plans. You can start doing better tax planning. You can start doing dashboarding. I mean, like you said, it all starts with that granular information and the trust, because if you don't have that trust and relationship, the client's not going to talk to you, and you know very little about the business, and you're pigeonholed.
You're stuck, for sure. The other thing too that I've seen, you know, we've been really fortunate that since we started Helm, that we've been able to work with accounting and bookkeeping professionals to get them started in offering cash flow as a service. And a lot of times there's just a lack of confidence around offering any sort of advisory, because they have previously been pigeonholed and they've kind of done a very traditional role, and the clients viewed them in that traditional role. And so what happens is that when you create your first cash flow forecast, you just have such an understanding of the business that you instantly have more confidence to go to the client to ask more questions, to get a more forecast that's more reflective of actually what will happen or potentially will happen, and that you just have different dialogue with the client. But you've got the confidence to have that different dialogue because you really know the business inside and out. Because I know for myself that if I'm going to the client and having a conversation with them and I don't yet have very much information about them, I don't have a ton of confidence in giving them any sort of advice or any sort of answers, because I feel like I just don't know enough yet. Versus once you know that, you've got that foundational level, you'll be surprised at how much confidence that just gives you to have different dialogue with the client.
For sure. So we wanted to look at a few use cases. So, you know, we're saying that advisory begins with cash flow, which maybe is the bold statement, but, you know, let's talk about that a little bit. So we looked at our own clients in our own accounting firm and said, you know, who would be good examples of, you know, who we did cash management services for, and what did that look like before and after, and how did things change? And so one of my favorite examples is always my energy services client. They're in a difficult industry to begin with. And so what I mean by that is it's energy services is highly cyclical. So it's price dependent. So if the price is high, you're doing good. And if the oil price is low, you're not doing so good because people aren't drilling wells. But there's also a weather related pattern there. So in Canada, when it's really cold, you can actually drill a lot of wells. But in the spring and in the fall, the ground gets really mushy. You can't actually drive big trucks on site. They just get stuck. And so the drilling stops. We actually have road bans. So you legally can't even drive. So they're dealing in an industry that's extremely cyclical and volatile. And interestingly enough, it's also an industry with really bad terms. Their customers are terrible because it's these big companies like Shell, Encana, Synovus, I'm trying to think of names.
Powerhouse.
Global conglomerates that
Husky.
are Husky. They're all drilling these. They're massive companies, and essentially they're forcing you to take their terms. So even though your terms might be 15 days, it really is irrelevant because these guys have so much power, especially in a recession where you're trying to get as much business as you possibly can. They essentially dictate terms. And so your terms might be 15, but their terms are probably more akin to 90 or 120. So it's very common to be paid in the energy services industry in Canada at the very minimum in 90 days. And so this poor company is essentially paying all of their fuel bills, all of their employees, all up front in advance, and then they get paid 90 days later. So their cash gap is essentially a minimum of 90 days, probably more upwards of 120. Now you compound that with the recession, which happened a few years ago, and essentially they're in a position where they're getting paid slow. They're trying to manage their expenses. The revenues are going down, prices going down, drilling stopping. Generally speaking, what I'm trying to say is what was happening before was a very bad situation. It's their economic conditions. The company was run really well, very good management, but the economy in general was just not on their side. Mm-hmm. And so it was really interesting because when we started, we were with them while the times were good, but we were very much pigeonholed. Yeah. So we were very much, you do my tax returns, you do my sales tax, the GST returns, make sure you do the necessary evils. And other than that, I'm going to tell you about that $300,000 truck we bought 6 months after the fact, and we'll figure it out. Don't worry about it. Mm-hmm. And so once the recession hit, it really magnified that. And it said, it's not possible anymore because essentially the revenues went down by half overnight. They really needed to start looking at that cyclicality, seasonality in the year because they needed essentially to live from January to the next January. And if they didn't manage their cash properly, they could no longer just guess and rely on their big bank account. They actually had to have processes in place in order to do that. And so what we did is at a very high level, we just simply came in and said, look, guesswork doesn't work anymore. You can't actually just say, I'm going to pay for it and worry about it later. You're in trouble with the bank. At this point, they were actually in a negative $1 million working capital position. They were actually on the verge of bankruptcy. They were in special projects, which is essentially the step before bankruptcy. And all that we did as a firm is we came in and said, look, guys, you need to match your inflows with your outflows. That's all we're doing. Mm-hmm. That's cash management at its core. And so at a very high level, we can't increase our revenues. It's simply not possible. Prices are going down. People are stopping drilling. There's concern around the industry globally. They're not sure what's going on. So increasing revenue is really not a good option. And so in order to close the cash gap, you essentially had to decrease expenses as your first point, and then also start matching the payments to the actual inflows. So your expenses and your capital spending to any income and any AR that was flowing into the company. And so there was no processes in place before. These guys were very ad hoc, just shooting from the hip, doing whatever they wanted. So our first step was essentially coming in and saying, look, at a high level, we're just matching inflows and outflows. So what we're going to do as a first step is create weekly meetings. And these weekly meetings, we're going to say, what's in the bank account now? What do we see coming in the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 4 months? What's the probability on that? And then that gives us an indication of how much money we have to spend. And then we're trying to cut expenses because it's a downturn and we needed to shed some costs, but also who can we push in terms of payments? We need to pay important operational items like fuel bills, repair bills for the trucks, because if the trucks aren't working or running, you make no money, period. Yeah. We need to look at cutting salaries, all these different things. But salaries, again, are also an immediate expense. Like you have to pay those or else you stop working again. Mm-hmm. So you have to look at all of the outflows as well. And so we had to essentially prioritize the people that we could. So there's certain people that you have to pay, employees, rent, all of those. But everybody else, we really took a hard look at and said, much like our customers, your terms might be 15 or 30 days, but at the end of the day, we simply can't pay you. So we have to push you back. And so it's not a fair situation. It simply was what it was. But that's what we had to come in and do. High level, just matching inflows and outflows, but at a weekly level, actually prioritizing vendors. And again, just matching those inflows and outflows. And we would do that once a week. And so every single week we would do the same thing. We would look at who did we expect to pay and who did actually pay. And if they did pay, okay, now we can pay these 4 or 5 people. and do the same thing the next week. Okay, Sunnova's paid, so now we can pay these 4 vendors. Okay, now Husky paid, now we can pay these 4 vendors. And we just got into that habit, and it kind of happened organically. We didn't put a big structure around it, but it happened organically, where the management of this company essentially went from, I'm not telling you anything until it's 6 months after the fact, to they actually started asking questions in advance, where it just got them into the frame of mind of saying, okay, look, I know I'm having this meeting and I'm not allowed to pay this bill because I'll go bankrupt if I don't. But I need to talk to you first, and we need to plan around it. And it was very interesting because essentially we got them from over 3 to 4 years now. We got them from that negative $1 million working capital position to actually a positive $500,000 working capital position. They're out of special projects. If you looked at their past history of EBITDA and cash flow and net income, the last 3 to 4 years have been the most stable that they've ever had. And they're actually probably the second, third, and fourth highest profitability years of all time, even in a massive recession. So the overall picture has been entirely positive from a financial aspect, because they simply sat down, started planning. We were now accountable for each other. So I was accountable to produce the reports, but they were also accountable for actually talking to me about it and having that relationship. And doing that simple step on a weekly basis essentially got us to a point of where everybody should get to, which is, growth plans, very stable, look into the future. A very interesting relationship, because it created a very positive financial result. The bank loved us, still does now. One of the top performing companies in Western Canada. So that was pretty cool. All stemming from that weekly meeting. And so very interesting is, now that we're in a very good cash flow routine, we're still having those weekly meetings. And the reason that we're doing that is just simply best practice. And so every single week we still go through the same process. We have a little more leeway because we have more money in the bank, so to speak. But we still have all the same meetings, and it's created this very interesting dynamic where, from our relationship standpoint, we are now the trusted advisors. So they essentially come to our team, and they never make a decision without us now, because we got them through that bad time, and they're now loyal, and they trust us to no end. But on top of that, they actually see all the benefit that we can provide. So, it's not just a trust thing and, hey, you got us through this, but it's, hey, that actually worked really well. And it's actually creating this process and the structure that is making us so much better as a company. We're now that trusted advisor. So they will refer us to no end to all of their friends and family and whoever has a business. And it's just created an overall a great experience.
That's something that you just brought up that I didn't include in these slides, or that we didn't even think to add. But, when you start to do advisory services and cash flow services, where you take a client from a negative, what did you say, 1 million working cap?
It's Canadian, so that's about 2 cents.
Not quite that bad, but it's pretty substantial negative working cap to a positive situation. I mean, you do naturally get new referrals from that client. Like, the client values you in such a way that they become like a raving fan. If you've ever read that book, Raving Fans, they naturally become a raving fan because you saved their business. And so, one of the things that we've often talked about is, when it comes to advisory services, it can be hard to market the service, because again, you kind of get lumped into like a business consultant, depending on how you word it, or they still can't see the differentiator between yourself and a traditional bookkeeper, traditional accounting type services. And so it becomes difficult to market. And that, for us, our greatest lead source has always been our existing clients. Yes. And it's because of work like that, where you've taken them from such a brutal spot where they were near bankruptcy through to being in a good spot again, where now they're, what did you say, #1 in Western Canada?
Yeah, it's one of the top ones for sure.
Yeah, and so that's a significant swing in a short period of time. Like, what was that, 4 years since the recession? And so that's a pretty big swing in that time period, to go from practically death of a business through to that. And so that naturally just creates a great referral source for more of similar type clients.
Well, and even adding on that point, it would be a great marketing material for a website as well. So, if you have a story like that where you can help somebody and they become raving fans, I mean, that in of itself is great marketing material on a website, social media, whatever.
A case study on
a case study for how you took them from start to finish, from a place of dismay to a place of success.
Yeah, if you had, man, I'm just picturing it now. You have like a testimonial that goes, short testimonial on your social, and
you wouldn't want their testimonial.
links
There'd be lots of swears.
That's the oil and gas services industry. But if you have some sort of short testimonial that links to the longer use case or the case study, yeah, there's, if you catch somebody's attention with like, boy, these guys saved us. And so, yeah, anyways, I'm kind of going off on a tangent now, but
Marketing 101.
yeah, we didn't think to bring that up in here, how it just organically can create some different types of marketing, because your clients are literally raving about you because you're offering a service that they didn't even know existed, without having a full-time CFO that's $150,000, $200,000 plus per year, which obviously, based on their state with their finances, they couldn't afford that. Right. And so you've given them that solution at a price that they could afford, and got them out of a spot that was near bankruptcy.
Well, and one offshoot that we should speak about too is they are now in a position during a recession where they're so successful financially that they can actually start growing in a recession.
Yeah, that's cool. Impressive to grow in a recession in that industry. So, all right, so our next client that we'll share about is a very different industry from oil and gas services. I've spoke about this client in the past when we've spoke about cash flow, because it was a very complex, I shouldn't say complex, it was a consolidated cash flow forecast that was very time consuming, in the sense of it ended up being 9 different entities being consolidated into one. But let's kind of just start with the situation. So when we started working with this client, they had 4 locations to their fitness franchise, and 2 of those locations were doing very well. The next one was being poorly managed, and so it wasn't performing well. So they were able to easily excuse the poor performance with poor management. And the 4th one, when we started working with them, literally had been open for like 2 months. So it was so new that they couldn't even evaluate the performance. And so, because fitness is such a trendy industry, and this is a very niche type fitness franchise, the business owners are trying to take advantage of that trend, because with a lot of trends, whether it's, CrossFit or yoga or spin, it kind of becomes a bit trendy. And so when a business owner is in that industry, they're trying to take full advantage of the trend while it lasts. And so that was their spot, as they were trying to take advantage of the trend, and they grew too quickly. And what that looked like was, before we started working with them, they had these 4 locations, but they had committed to 5 more locations. And they had used their first 2 locations, which were performing quite well, as their example of how the other 5 that they hadn't opened yet, plus the other 2 that weren't performing well yet, were going to perform. And truth is, if that had been the case, if they had all been star performers like the first 2, their cash flow would have been positive month over month. But what they neglected to consider in there is that not every location can be a star performer, just due to different locations, different markets. I mean, the first 4 locations were here in Calgary, but then they expanded to Vancouver and to Toronto, where it was completely different markets. And, you got competitors in the surrounding neighborhoods, etc. And so what happened was, they committed to these other 5, not realizing that the next 5 would not necessarily be star performers. The 2 that weren't performing well were pretty tough to get to be star performers, just because of a couple of different things. There was poor management, and that management was somebody who had bought in. So that's not a quick and easy get that person out and get it remanaged differently. And then the other location was just kind of when you think about that location in Calgary, it should have done really well based on this industry, but it didn't. It was a bit of a dud. It was tucked back away. It didn't have a good location. There was a lot of competition up in that space, in that neighborhood, and it just wasn't performing well. And so they committed to all 5 of these new ones when they had 2 duds and 2 star performers. And so when they first came to us, they weren't in a negative cash flow situation yet. but literally in the time it takes, I mean, when we start working with a client, we don't right out of the gates do cash flow forecasting. We take our time to set up the systems. And if you go back to our kind of a rewind to some of those previous episodes, there's steps that have to be there in order to offer cash flow forecasting. And one of those is like the timely, accurate, clean data. So we took the steps to get them set up onto an accounting system, get them using, in this case, it was HubDoc, and get them actually into a rhythm of getting timely data, firstly, because they came to us with Excel spreadsheets that they were using for their accounting.
Everything.
Yeah, but for all of their accounting was in Excel spreadsheets. And so there was obviously some setup time. And I feel like literally in the time that it took us to get them set up and into a rhythm in a few months was the time it took for them to start to be in a not good cash flow situation. And so naturally, our role just shifted into being more of an advisor and offering cash flow forecasting. And what that forecasting looked like is, obviously, to begin with, all 4 locations were combined because these had common ownership, and money transferred between locations, as you can imagine, very frequently, because you got the 2-star performers that were essentially subsidizing the other 2 duds, and then the startup of the new ones. And they did have small business loans for the startup of the new ones, but that small business loans don't cover everything. They cover the operation or the leasehold improvements to get set up and any sort of purchases of furniture and whatnot that needs to take place, but they don't cover the operating costs to get up to a point where you're generating revenue and becoming break even. And so each new location had a substantial startup cost that was being subsidized by the first 2 locations that were the star performers. So our cash flow forecasting quickly became a weekly endeavor where we consolidated all locations that were open at the time. And as Kelvin said, I mean, essentially what you're doing with cash flow forecasting is you're matching your cash outputs to your cash inputs. And the same case applied here, where it's different because we didn't have accounts receivable. Obviously, you don't let somebody come in and take a fitness class and they pay you later. You take payment on the spot, or that people are on monthly memberships or buy 10 card punch passes. There was a variety of different forms of payment within their business. And so it was, first thing was to spread their vendor payments as much as possible. So same idea in terms of they had rents, they had lease payments, and they had payroll. So rent and payroll were very fixed. Obviously, those could not move. But even the loan payments, we made adjustments to the timing of those loan payments so that they weren't at the same time as their rent payment. So it was spreading the payments, the outflows of cash throughout the month. And then there were some vendors that they paid for things like the small amount of merchandise that they carried, or the cleaners that came in who had some vendor tolerance. And what I mean by that is that you could pay them with a bit of wiggle room. So maybe it was due on the 15th, but you could pay by the 20th and it's still fine. So a big part of that process was making sure that we had enough income or incoming money versus outgoing money to just basically smooth the cash flow forecasting as much as possible, or the cash ins and outs as much as possible. And so that became, and of course, transfer between the various locations. And so when we took that on, I mean, I don't think that they first realized kind of what their state really was. And, but they started to then realize that, for how lean we were getting, how tight we were getting in cash, knowing that they had still other locations to open. And what that did was it just naturally created this level of trust that essentially she stopped, the main owner that was handling more of the financial side, she's just stopped looking at the bank account altogether. She just trusted us to manage the payments because she knew that payroll was getting met because nobody was complaining. She knew that rent was obviously getting paid because the landlord wasn't complaining, and that the vendors were still issuing, ongoing work or ongoing merchandise. So she knew that everything was being handled. She felt comfortable with that and then trusted us to just handle it. And so we essentially became an integral part of her business, or their business, because that was the biggest problem for them right at that time. I mean, there was nothing else that was more pressing to them than managing the cash. Their tax returns didn't matter. I mean, we did their tax returns, that didn't matter. Their payroll truthfully doesn't matter. If you can't afford to pay the payroll, it doesn't matter if the payroll is processed. So the biggest thing for them was managing the cash and ensuring we had enough money to pay what needed to be paid when it needed to be paid. So, you know, in their situation, you know, I do think we can boldly say that we helped them stay in business, because it was a big responsibility to be able to manage their cash, but they did pay for the service. I mean, they valued the service, and we became a partner with them that they knew that they couldn't really manage without, and that it was difficult for them to ever see somebody else in the role that we had, because we had taken on so much of the stress. Like, if you think about, you've committed to 5 more locations and you know that you're already in a bad spot, for you to, as a business owner, to not have to worry about the cash.
Yep.
I like just think about that. It's a huge level of stress relief for them. And so that was what they were paying for, and that's what they valued. And they too became, you know, a great referral source for us, in terms of, you know, speaking to what it was that we had done for them. And it's, the relationship really started as more of a traditional accounting, bookkeeping, payroll provider, and evolved very quickly due to circumstances, into something that was so much more. So it's a great example, because a lot of times we think, well, somebody who's cash-based business, there's not really any cash flow forecasting you can do, which is so untrue from our experience. These guys were definitely cash-based, and you couldn't really change the timing of what came in. You could do some things around market, like encourage them to do some different marketing and whatnot to try to increase their revenue, but you couldn't change the timing. And what came in is what came in. And so it was all about managing what went out when, and they didn't have a lot of vendors that had much tolerance. So that's what created a big responsibility to ensure that the payroll was paid and ensure that the rent was paid. But it definitely created a partnership with them that I don't think either one of us expected it to go to that deep of a level. And it was simply due to circumstances, just with them having committed to 5 other locations.
I think, excuse me, one thing that I kind of pulled out of there that was probably the same with my example was they're not gaining just loyalty and trust in the relationship, but one thing that I picked up on was that they gained a better understanding for where they were actually at. You know, and so I think that's something interesting to point out, is that when you're pigeonholed as a traditional accountant, bookkeeper, advisor, whatever you want to call it, you're often put into that space, and people aren't necessarily valuing exactly what you do because you're just doing the necessary evils. But in each one of those cases, in doing the weekly managerial type accounting or bookkeeping, it highlighted that bigger picture too, in the sense of, oh, that necessary evil that you're doing actually had some really valuable information in it as well. So it was a nice compliment in terms of that, and adding the value there, because again, they now put more value on the other stuff that you did as well, not just the actual cash flow forecasting and cash management.
Yeah, for sure. That's a great add.
I'll try to make this one quick so that we have time.
I think we just have one question so far. If anyone else has a question, then go ahead and throw it into the Q&A. And once we get through just a couple more slides here, then we'll go ahead and answer those.
This will be lightning round.
It's the easier one to do is lightning round.
So we did want to highlight, you know, in both of those examples, there are clients that were under distress for one reason or another. But we always say that everybody does need cash flow forecasting and cash management, in our opinion. And so here's an example of a company that, again, no accounts receivable. They pay in cash. It's a vet clinic. So people come in the door with their cat or dog, big horse, whatever that might be. They pay with a credit card. So the revenues and the inflows are actually immediate, very stable. There's a lot of it. This business was really profitable. And so the situation here was a little bit interesting in the sense that this vet clinic opened up in a rural community. It was very profitable. They started out in a very small location. So they actually went out and bought land, built a brand new building because they had bigger visions of being bigger and scaling and growing and all that fun stuff. But it was interesting in the sense that they didn't really take out a true traditional mortgage with, say, a 15 to a 20-year commercial term. They actually took out loans that had very short terms, anywhere from 5 to 10. And that was actually by their choice, because they wanted to pay the debt off in the business as quickly as they could. And so what happened here, unfortunately, is that because they had such aggressive payment terms, it was actually hurting themselves personally. They actually couldn't draw funds out of the business because the vet clinic itself was actually strapped for cash. It wasn't hyper negative, it wasn't in distress, but it certainly wasn't making enough that the owners could draw out what they wanted to and probably should have done. And so, again, going back to what you said, there was a foundational level there. We got systems in place, did proper bookkeeping, got proper processes in place. But essentially what we did for them was the same as everybody else. We matched the cash inflows and the outflows. And we said, look, if you got new mortgage financing on your commercial property and you got it with proper term, this is what the inflows and outflows would look like. So we did a little bit of a future looking, forward looking cash flow forecast. And again, we didn't do 3 to 5 years. We just said at a very high level, you know, on a monthly in and out basis, here's what you have coming in and here's what you have going out. And here's what it looks like with a new financing structure in place. And so what that allowed us to do is essentially, I think we reduced their payments by about 30 or 40%, I think, if not more. And that allowed them to draw out those funds personally, which then allowed them to pay their bills, pay their own personal mortgage, started saving for their kids. It put them in a much better frame of mind because they could actually enjoy the benefits of their actual hard-earned effort. And it wasn't that we were over leveraging the company. We actually were still very, very conservative in the leverage that we were applying to the business. And so that was a good conversation to have, in the sense of, you don't need to be so aggressive, but you don't have to be super conservative either. There's a happy medium somewhere in there where everybody wins. So the business is still cash flow positive. You're taking in more money than you probably ever dreamed possible. And now you can do everything that you want to do. So more vacations, you know, set up education funds, all of that fun stuff. And so that end result really put us in, again, that highly trusted advisor position, because we took something very simple and turned it into a very big plus on the economic side, both corporately and personally, which then again has turned into more referral business, a very trusted client. Like, they love us, they're loyal, they always will be. And so that's kind of the takeaway, is it doesn't have to be just a company in distress. It can also just be a normal cash flow company. Positive. Main point being that you can have a return. The main goal is a return on investment. And so ensuring that the business owners are drawing what they should be out of a business, because at the end of the day, you shouldn't be hoarding cash in a company. You know, you want to allocate it either to growth, or you want to return it to investors or the business owners. And so that's a very good use case for cash management as well, in terms of, you know, you can go to a vet clinic and they could not even have this financial problem, this financing problem. You could just say, look, guys, if you just did it this way and we managed the ins and outs a little more appropriately, you could be taking in $2,000 to $3,000 to $4,000 whatever dollars per month more. Would you like that? Yes or no? I'm guessing that the answer is probably going to be yes most of the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's great that we can just add in that other one, because it is something we hear often, is that somebody who's cash flow positive doesn't need cash flow forecasting. And so it's just a different use case. It's a different dialogue with the client.
Yep.
And, you know, the weekly conversations that we're having with the other two clients, you know, this isn't a weekly conversation with this client, but it's still something that was as a result of really being able to identify and show them their cash flow forecast, that put them into a different position. And now they aren't leveraged as much personally, because they aren't running their businesses aggressively in terms of paying off their loans.
Yep. We still go through the process with them on a monthly and a yearly basis, though, in terms of,
oh yes, for sure,
you know, managing around their capital expenditures. Because if you're trying to distribute as much as you possibly can, you still need the optics around what you're doing.
Yeah, it's just not.
And I know you know
weekly,
that. I just didn't
the weekly. No, for sure. No, I'm glad that you brought that up. Yeah, it's just the difference with it being a monthly and quarterly annual discussions versus the weekly. Like, okay, pay this one, not this one.
Yep.
Just a very different dialogue.
Different frequency.
Excellent. So if we've convinced you that cash flow forecasting is the place to start with advisory, we've talked about them already in this webinar, but we do have 4 other webinars that we've published or put out over the past 6-7 months. And so the very first one is actually called Cash Flow Where to Start. And it talks about firstly having clean data, and then the different types of cash flow forecasting, and kind of defining those to dictate what it is that you're trying to then offer for each particular client, etc. And then it goes into cash flow conversations, cash flow complications, pricing, packaging, and selling, and then now we've done this one. So there's kind of this plethora of information that if you start at that very first one and work your way through, then you'll kind of get all of the information in terms of what we feel is kind of the place to start, and then different things that you can experience along the way. All right, time for some questions. Move these over so that you can read them.
Okay. And so I guess the first question is, do we provide cash flow management training essentially outside of apps? And I'll let you answer that one, actually.
I don't know how much we can share about it just yet, but we do have something in the works.
I was hoping you were going to do big announcement.
No, we'll hang tight. Give us another few weeks here. But we do have something in the works in terms of
we do have a lot of people asking
this
question.
It is a common question, and we do have a plethora of information that I'm putting together that we're going to be able to get you to get your hands on it. And so it's going to be a cash flow education that's going to be probably 10 modules long is what it's looking like, where there'll be kind of workbook style and some video and some written content. And that's kind of the long answer. The short answer is it's coming.
Yeah.
It's not available quite yet, but it is coming.
Correct.
Yeah.
And so the next question would be, actually the next two would be more Helm specific.
Okay.
So the first question is, do you price in Canadian dollars? All my customers are in Canadian dollars. That is also a question that we get a lot. Unfortunately, right now it is in US dollars, and it'll probably continue to be that way for the near term. And the only reason that that is occurring is because we want to spend our development dollars on actually putting out features. At some point, we will be pricing it in Canadian dollars. We just aren't sure exactly when that will happen, just because there's some coding that has to happen on the back end and integrations with Stripe and yada yada. So
when you first start using Stripe, they use the global currency of US dollars, and so in order to be able to convert it to your local currency, then there's some development time that needs to get put into that. So it's coming. It's just we're trying to get features released as opposed to.
And we fully appreciate being Canadian based, the pain in the butt that then has, because the price essentially fluctuates.
Yeah, for sure.
Next question would be, does Helm automate the forecasting that we're talking about? And yes, I would say that it does. In all of this, all of these cases, we're talking about the grander cash management process. And so forecasting is simply the first step in this entire process, where, as Twyla likes to say, you do your forecast and you're essentially creating the bank statements for the next 2 to 3 to 6 months, whatever that case might be. And then there's routines that happen off of that, say paying the bills or collecting receivables. There's all of these things that need to happen after you do the forecast. And so right now, Helm as it sits helps automate that forecasting piece so that you don't have to use Excel, because Excel is prone to errors. One of the biggest problems we always had wasn't actually with the human error component, even though I know I made a lot of mistakes in it from time to time. It was more on the training side for a firm. My spreadsheet wouldn't look the same and feel the same as yours, so you would have a hard time understanding it. If we got employees, they would have a hard time understanding it. And trying to convey that information to a client was the same thing. It might make sense to us, but maybe not to the client, because it's in a grid and a table format, and they just kind of lost interest. So Helm helps with that piece right now in terms of the forecasting, and in the future we will and do want to move towards actually automating as much of the overall process as we possibly can. So having the system help pay the bills, help collect the receivables, help give notifications on insufficient funds, hooking into other investment platforms potentially. I mean, the world is really endless. We're super passionate about this space, so our problem will be trying to pick what we're going to build first, probably.
Yeah. We've got some things in the works, but some exciting announcements coming about new product features. But we really designed Helm to be something that would automate, would still be visual, would be easier to set up and to maintain than an Excel spreadsheet, or even some of the other ones that we've tried, and be able to be a tool that you can use ongoing, so that piece, the dialogue obviously still needs to be had with the client, but that the actual forecast is more automated and is more efficient to actually set it up and maintain it.
Yeah, I know we found with our clients, if we compare it to the spreadsheets we used to use, we found anywhere from 20 to 50% time savings, if not higher.
Yeah, depending on
the client and the process.
And depending on your Excel skills, truly.
Yep,
You've got some pretty intense Excel skills. All right, so the next one's about finding the other webinars. What I can do is when I send out the email with the link to this webinar, this webinar, then I will include the link to the other webinars for you guys.
Yeah.
So, perfect. I think that's all of the questions that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like somebody wants to be guinea pig for the training. Shoot me a note back from the email that I'll send out later today, and we can chat. It looks like we've covered everything else. So thank you everyone for your time. We appreciate that your time is extremely valuable. So thank you for spending an hour of it with us. And you will receive a copy of the recording. If you have any other questions, please let us know. As for where to find us,
I was going to say, if you want to ask us questions, feel free to email away. We're happy to answer questions directly sent through email. We have our Facebook group, the Helmiak Community. Feel free to post questions on there. That's not just cash flow specific either. If you had any other questions, we would be more than happy to try to give our 2 cents on our experiences in terms of the overall advisory space. So it could even be 5-year forecasting. I've got a problem client. What does it look like? You know, it can really be anything and everything. We're really trying to help people out as much as we possibly can. Not saying that we have all the answers, but with a big community and a big group, there's a lot of expertise in the community already. So the more questions that are asked there, the better. You're going to get some really good answers out of it.
Yeah, for sure. Perfect. And then of course our website, takethehelm.app. So thank you all again. Appreciate your time today. And yeah, we're here to help any way that we can. So don't hesitate to reach out to us.
Correct.
Thanks guys.
See ya.